Elvis Presley was born on January 8, 1935, in the small town of Tupelo, Mississippi, in a modest two-room house built by his father and relatives. His arrival into the world was marked by tragedy, as he was born a twin, but his brother, Jesse Garin, was stillborn. The weight of this loss shaped his family's life, leaving a quiet shadow in their home, while Elvis grew up as an only child, surrounded by the devotion and expectations of his parents. His father, Vernon, struggled to provide for the family, working a series of odd jobs, often barely managing to keep food on the table. His mother, Gladys, devoted herself entirely to her son, raising him with strict values, deep religious faith, and an unwavering bond that would remain central to his life. Life in Tupelo was defined by poverty. The Presleys often lived on the edge of survival, moving between rented houses and relying on relatives when times became especially difficult. Their small home lacked many of the comforts others might have taken for granted. But Gladys instilled in her son the belief that dignity and strength came not from possessions but from character. Elvis grew up shy and quiet, deeply attached to his mother, and often stood apart from other children, not entirely fitting in, yet observing everything around him with sensitivity. From an early age, music entered his life as both comfort and inspiration. The family attended the Assembly of God Church, where the sound of gospel singing filled the air with passion and spirit. The power of those voices rising together in praise left a profound impression on the young boy. Outside the church walls, Elvis heard a different kind of music. The rhythms of African American blues drifted from the neighborhoods nearby, raw and emotional, carrying stories of hardship and resilience. On the radio, he discovered the twang of country music, storytelling and song that spoke of love, loss, and the struggles of everyday people. These three influences, gospel, blues, and country, wove together inside him, creating a musical foundation that would later blossom into something entirely new. Elvis was not born into privilege, yet his world was rich in contrasts. The divide between black and white communities in the segregated South was stark, but music ignored those boundaries. He wandered into places where blues musicians played, soaking in the sounds, and listened intently to records borrowed from friends or played in local shops. His ears were open to everything, and even though he was still just a boy, he carried within him a growing sense that music could transcend barriers that society insisted upon maintaining. At school, Elvis was not a remarkable student, but he was diligent and curious in his own way. Teachers noticed his quiet nature, and classmates often teased him for being different, especially when he dressed in unusual styles or showed interest in music rather than the rougher pastimes of many boys his age. His family's poverty sometimes set him apart as well, but Elvis never lost his sense of pride. He worked small jobs to help support the household and carried himself with the determination of someone who wanted more from life. The gift of his first guitar became a defining moment. He received it at the age of 11, a modest instrument purchased by his mother when he had hoped for a bicycle. Though disappointed at first, he soon began to explore the instrument, learning chords and rhythms from neighbors and local musicians. The guitar became his companion, a tool through which he could translate the sounds and emotions swirling inside him into something tangible. He practiced relentlessly, often sitting alone for hours, his fingers pressing against the strings until they hurt, but the pain only deepened his commitment. As he entered adolescence, the pull of music grew stronger. He attended performances, watched traveling shows, and observed the way audiences responded to entertainers. He was fascinated by how a singer could command attention, stir emotions, and bring people together. The idea that he might one day do the same seemed distant, almost impossible for a boy from a struggling family in Mississippi. Yet the seed of ambition had been planted. Elvis's bond with his parents, particularly with Gladys, shaped his sense of self during these formative years. She was his constant protector and confidant, instilling in him humility and a sense of responsibility, even as she encouraged his love of music. Vernon's struggles with work and occasional trouble with the law reminded Elvis of the fragility of stability, reinforcing his determination to rise above hardship. The family's faith in God anchored them through challenges, and Elvis absorbed the belief that perseverance, guided by faith and hard work, could lead to something greater. By the time the Presleys moved to Memphis in 1948, Elvis was a teenager carrying with him not only the weight of his family's struggles, but also a growing sense of his own voice. The move would open new doors, but the roots of his identity had already been formed in the fields, churches, and streets of Tupelo. His humble beginnings gave him empathy for ordinary people and a deep connection to the struggles of those who lived with little. More importantly, they gave him the foundation of musical influences and personal resilience that would guide him for the rest of his life. The boy who once sat quietly in church pews and listened to the rhythms of his surroundings was already preparing, though unknowingly, to change the soundscape of America. His story began in simplicity and struggle, but within that environment, the elements of a legend were quietly taking shape. When Elvis and his family settled in Memphis in 1948, he was still just a shy teenager, carrying with him the weight of his humble background and the restless ambition to find something greater. Memphis was a city alive with sound, a crossroads where blues, gospel, country, and rhythm and blues intertwined. For Elvis, who had grown up immersed in these influences, the city became both a challenge and an opportunity. He worked small jobs to support his family, from driving trucks to assisting in local businesses. But his thoughts were rarely far from music. The guitar that had become his companion in Tupelo remained his refuge, and he spent countless hours practicing, experimenting, and letting the music of the city seep deeper into his soul. Though he dreamed of being heard, he did not have connections, financial support, or formal training. His voice, however, carried a distinctive quality that set him apart. In private, friends and family encouraged him to sing, noticing the sincerity and rawness that emerged whenever he performed. In 1953, at the age of 18, Elvis walked into Sun's studio on Union Avenue with the modest intention of recording a song as a gift for his mother. The studio, owned by Sam Phillips, had already earned a reputation for capturing the voices of local musicians, especially African-American performers who rarely found opportunities in the mainstream industry. That small studio session was meant to be personal, but it marked the first step towards something far larger. Sam Phillips was not immediately struck by the young man. Elvis was polite, quiet, and nervous, his blonde hair combed back and his appearance neat yet unassuming. He recorded a few ballads, simple songs that showcased his voice but did not yet reveal the full force of his potential. The recordings sat largely unnoticed for months. Yet Elvis did not give up. He returned to the studio again, eager to try, persistent in his hope that music could become more than a private passion. The turning point came in 1954, during another late-night session at Sun. Elvis, joined by guitarist Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black, began fooling around with a rhythm and blues number, That's All Right. It was spontaneous, filled with an energy that electrified the small room. Phillips, listening from the control booth, suddenly realized he had found the sound he had been searching for. A white singer who could capture the spirit of black rhythm and blues while making it accessible to a broader audience. That recording, raw and alive, would soon be played on local radio stations, and the response was immediate. Listeners flooded the stations with calls, wanting to know who this new singer was. Elvis's first performances outside the studio were modest. He appeared at local venues, school auditoriums, and small theaters, often greeted with mixed reactions. His stage presence, however, could not be ignored. He moved differently than other singers of the time, swaying and shifting in ways that reflected the rhythm inside him. For some, it was shocking, even scandalous, but for the youth who packed into those rooms, it was thrilling. His appearance, handsome, youthful, yet carrying an intensity beyond his years, made him a magnetic figure. As he continued to perform, word spread quickly. He was soon traveling across the South, often performing on bills alongside other emerging musicians. Crowds grew larger and the atmosphere more charged. His fusion of gospel fervor, blues rawness, and country storytelling resonated deeply with younger audiences who longed for something fresh. The older generation, however, often looked at him with suspicion, questioning his style and accusing him of breaking moral boundaries. This divide between admiration and criticism only fueled his rise, giving him an aura of rebellion that spoke directly to a generation coming of age in the 1950s. The press began to take notice. Newspapers wrote about his performances, sometimes praising his talent, sometimes warning of his influence. His movements on stage earned him nicknames and sparked debates about decency. Yet the attention only magnified his presence. The contrast between the adoration of his fans and the alarm of his critics made him a figure impossible to ignore. In the span of just a few months, Elvis Presley transformed from a shy Memphis truck driver to a rising star whose name began to echo across the South. Behind the growing fame was still a young man adjusting to the weight of public attention. He remained deeply tied to his family, particularly to his mother, who worried about the sudden changes in his life. He often returned home to share his experiences, grounding himself in the simple values that had guided him since childhood. Yet the pull of the stage was undeniable. Each performance, each recording drew him further into the world of music, where he began to realize that his voice and his presence could reach far beyond Memphis. By the end of 1954, his songs were being played regularly on radio stations, and his concerts drew ever larger crowds. The transformation had begun. Elvis was no longer just a boy with a guitar and a dream. He had become a symbol of something new, a bridge between traditions, and a spark that hinted at the cultural revolution to come. His first steps toward the stage were filled with uncertainty, but they carried within them the unmistakable momentum of destiny. By the mid-1950s, Elvis Presley had moved far beyond the uncertain beginnings of his first studio sessions. The small stages and regional tours of his early career quickly gave way to larger venues, and the audience that gathered to see him was unlike anything the music world had witnessed before. His records, released under the RCA Victor label after his landmark contract with Sun Records was sold, spread across the nation with astonishing speed. Within months, millions of copies had been sold, and his voice was no longer confined to the South. It was filling jukeboxes, radios, and living rooms from coast to coast. The impact of his music lay in its fusion of elements that had rarely coexisted so powerfully. Rockabilly rhythms drove his songs with energy, while the soulfulness of gospel and the raw edge of rhythm and blues gave them depth. Country roots threaded through his melodies, creating a sound that was simultaneously familiar and startlingly new. For the first time, young people heard a voice that seemed to belong to them, not to the world of their parents. His songs carried an energy of rebellion, not through explicit protest, but through the way they broke free from established patterns. Concerts became the most visible manifestation of this cultural shift. When Elvis took the stage, the atmosphere transformed. The moment the first notes rang out, crowds erupted into screams, applause, and sometimes uncontrollable sobs. Young women were especially drawn to him, and their reactions, often captured by photographers and journalists, added to the sense that something extraordinary was happening. His movements, once criticized as awkward or even indecent, became iconic, inseparable from his identity as a performer. The sight of audiences overcome with emotion only amplified the frenzy surrounding his shows. Television accelerated his ascent. Appearances on programs such as The Ed Sullivan Show brought him into millions of households, making his name and face instantly recognizable. Parents and cultural commentators expressed alarm at his swaying hips and unrestrained style, but this only added to the fascination of the younger generation. Each appearance was met with record-breaking ratings, proving that his appeal was not a passing trend, but a force that was reshaping the entertainment landscape. He became, almost overnight, the embodiment of youth culture, a living symbol of freedom and possibility in a society that was beginning to question conformity. As his fame grew, opportunities expanded. Hollywood quickly sought him out, recognizing the magnetic quality that had made him a sensation on stage and television. His first films introduced him to audiences who might never have attended a concert or bought a record. Though critics sometimes dismiss these movies as formulaic, they nonetheless widened his reach and reinforced his image as more than a singer. He became an actor, an icon, and a marketable face for an entire industry eager to profit from his popularity. Despite the glamorous image projected to the world, the demands of this sudden fame were immense. Schedules became relentless, with tours, studio sessions, and film shoots stacked upon one another. Reporters followed his every move, and fans surrounded him wherever he went. The privacy of his earlier life disappeared, replaced by a whirlwind of obligations and expectations. Yet even under the weight of such pressure, his star continued to rise. His name appeared in headlines daily, his records dominated the charts, and his concerts broke attendance records across the country. The cultural establishment responded with a mixture of admiration and fear. Religious leaders, politicians, and community figures often spoke against him, labeling his performances as dangerous or immoral. Yet their criticism only seemed to strengthen his bond with the young. He was seen not just as a singer, but as a figure of defiance, someone unafraid to cross the boundaries set by the older generation. This dynamic solidified his role as the voice of a new era, a role that he had not consciously sought, but that had been thrust upon him by circumstance and talent. International recognition followed quickly. News of his success traveled overseas, where audiences were equally captivated by the energy and novelty of his music. Elvis Presley was no longer just an American star, he was a global phenomenon. His records sold in countries he had never visited, and his image appeared in magazines worldwide. The power of his appeal lay in its universality. Though rooted in the sounds of the American South, his music carried emotions and rhythms that resonated across cultures. By the late 1950s, Elvis had become more than a performer. He was a cultural icon, a touchstone for discussions about youth, morality, art, and society itself. His rise was meteoric, but it was also deeply symbolic. He represented not only the triumph of a singular talent, but also the broader transformation of music and culture in post-war America. His songs, his performances, and even his controversies revealed the shifting currents of a society in motion, one that was beginning to embrace change, energy, and individuality in ways it had long resisted. The rise to fame was not a smooth path, but it was undeniable. Elvis Presley, once the shy boy from Tupelo with a second-hand guitar, had become the face of a generation and the spark of a revolution that extended far beyond music. His voice, his style, and his presence were no longer his alone. They belonged to the millions who saw in him a reflection of their own desires and dreams. In just a few short years, he had ascended to a height that few could have imagined, securing his place as one of the most significant figures in modern culture. In 1958, Elvis Presley's life took a dramatic turn when he was drafted into the United States Army. At the height of his fame, when his music dominated the charts and his face appeared in newspapers and television across the nation, the news of his conscription shocked both fans and the entertainment industry. Many believed that 2 years away from the stage and studio would extinguish his meteoric rise. The entertainment business was notoriously fickle, and countless young stars had faded after much shorter absences. Yet for Elvis, this period of service became a crucible, reshaping his image and adding unexpected depth to his public persona. He reported for duty with little resistance, determined to prove that he was more than a cultural phenomenon. Unlike other celebrities who sought cushioned military assignments, Elvis entered as a regular soldier, subject to the same rules, routines, and hardships as his peers. He was stationed in Germany, where his daily life consisted of drills, training exercises, and the rigid discipline of army structure. The shift from the chaos of screaming fans to the order of military barracks was stark, but Elvis adapted with surprising resilience. His presence attracted attention, but he strove to blend in, refusing to take special treatment whenever possible. For many Americans, his willingness to serve as any other young man did won him newfound respect. During his time in Germany, Elvis experienced personal milestones that shaped his outlook. The death of his mother in 1958 devastated him, leaving a void that would remain throughout his life. Far from home, he shouldered grief privately, finding solace in the camaraderie of fellow soldiers and the demands of duty. In Europe, he also encountered a different cultural environment, one that broadened his horizons beyond the southern roots of his upbringing. His interactions with locals, the exposure to European music, and the routine of army life all contributed to a gradual transformation. Despite his absence from the stage, his presence in American culture did not entirely vanish. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, orchestrated a careful strategy to keep his name alive. Unreleased material was put out during his service, ensuring that his voice continued to reach listeners even as he wore a uniform thousands of miles away. Films and records produced before his draft kept circulating, and the public, instead of forgetting him, seemed to admire him more for fulfilling his duty. The narrative shifted. Elvis was no longer only the controversial performer who shocked conservative audiences with his movements. He was also a patriot, a man who placed service to his country above personal gain. When he returned to civilian life in 1960, the entertainment landscape had changed. New artists had risen, trends had shifted, and the competition was fierce. Yet Elvis's re-entry was carefully staged, beginning with the release of new recordings that reminded audiences of his unique voice. His first post-army album and singles topped the charts, signaling that his hold on the public's imagination was not broken. Appearances on television reinforced this revival, with audiences eager to see how the boy who had left had now matured into a man. However, the music industry was evolving, and the raw rock and roll energy of the mid-1950s was giving way to more polished productions. Elvis adjusted by exploring ballads, pop songs, and soundtrack recordings. His career increasingly became tied to Hollywood, where he starred in a string of films. These movies were commercially successful, often attracting large audiences who admired his charm and charisma on screen. Yet critics noted the formulaic nature of many of these projects, lamenting that his artistic potential was being constrained by repetitive scripts and predictable plots. Elvis, though aware of the criticism, continued to pursue these opportunities, balancing financial security with his desire to remain visible in a rapidly changing industry. The films served to expand his reach beyond the music charts, keeping him in the public eye even when musical trends began to shift toward new styles and emerging artists. The box office receipts proved that his star power remained intact, but there was a growing sense that his artistry was being diluted. Still, his loyal fan base stood by him, attending his films, purchasing his records, and celebrating his every public appearance. For them, Elvis symbolized not only music but also continuity, a reminder of the excitement that had defined the earlier years of rock and roll. The years immediately following his return were a period of both adjustment and resilience. He was no longer the rebellious youth whose movements scandalized parents. Instead, he projected the image of a mature, disciplined man who had served his country and returned to entertain his people. This shift broadened his appeal, particularly among older generations who now saw him in a new light. His career trajectory demonstrated that he was not a fleeting sensation, but a figure capable of adapting to different stages of life and society. Yet, beneath the surface of continued success, tensions lingered. The demands of constant film production and carefully managed appearances left little room for the raw spontaneity that had first electrified audiences. The balance between artistic authenticity and commercial strategy grew increasingly difficult to maintain. Nevertheless, Elvis's return from military service marked not a decline but a reinvention. He emerged as a figure who embodied not just the energy of rock and roll, but also responsibility, resilience, and adaptability. By the early 1960s, Elvis Presley had survived the test that many believed would end his career. He had transformed from the daring rebel of the 1950s into a man whose service and maturity broadened his cultural significance. Though challenges lay ahead, his ability to navigate the transition from soldier back to star ensured that his place in American music and culture remained secure. His time in the Army, once feared as a setback, had become an essential chapter in the story of his enduring legacy. By the late 1960s, Elvis Presley had undergone a remarkable resurgence that reaffirmed his place as one of the most influential figures in American music. After years of being overshadowed by a succession of formulaic Hollywood films and soundtrack recordings, his artistic credibility seemed to many to be in decline. Yet in 1968, with the airing of his televised comeback special, Elvis reclaimed his crown. Clad in black leather, performing with intensity and passion, he returned to the raw energy of his roots. The performance captivated audiences and critics alike, reminding the world of the charisma and talent that had made him a cultural icon more than a decade earlier. This moment was not only a triumph of performance, but also a personal statement of renewal, a declaration that he was not merely a relic of the past, but an artist with vitality and relevance. Following this turning point, Elvis launched into a new era of live performance. In 1969, he began his residency in Las Vegas at the International Hotel. The shows were lavish, dynamic productions that combined his powerful vocals with a commanding stage presence. Night after night, crowds filled the venue to witness his performances, which blended old classics with new material. The success of these concerts revived his career commercially and artistically, positioning him once again as one of the most compelling entertainers in the world. His voice, matured by age and experience, carried a depth and resonance that added new dimensions to his music. For fans, both old and new, his presence on stage reaffirmed the magic that had first defined him. Despite the outward triumph, the demands of this new phase of his career placed immense strain on his personal life. The pace of his performances was relentless, with repeated shows, tours, and engagements that left little room for rest or reflection. Behind the scenes, Elvis struggled with exhaustion, the pressure of maintaining his image, and the burden of expectations placed upon him by his management, particularly Colonel Tom Parker. The very success of his resurgence created a cycle of overwork that eroded his health and deepened his dependence on prescription medication. What began as a means of coping with sleepless nights and constant travel gradually became an unhealthy reliance that cast a shadow over his achievements. On stage, he radiated confidence, captivating audiences with his energy and charisma. Yet offstage, he often retreated into solitude, surrounded by a close circle but increasingly isolated in spirit. Fame had brought him adoration, wealth, and influence, but it also created a barrier between himself and the ordinary life he longed for. Friends and associates observed a man torn between the demands of his public role and his private need for authenticity and peace. In moments of quiet, Elvis wrestled with feelings of loneliness, questioning whether the life he led truly reflected his own desires or merely the machinery of the entertainment industry. His musical journey during this period reflected these contrasts. While his Las Vegas shows dazzled with grandeur, he also sought to reconnect with more personal and heartfelt music. Studio sessions produced songs that carried emotional weight, blending gospel, country, and soul influences that had shaped him since childhood. Tracks such as In the Ghetto revealed his ability to address social themes, while ballads showcased his deep emotional range. These moments demonstrated that beneath the spectacle of Las Vegas, Elvis remained an artist striving for meaning and sincerity. However, the duality of his existence grew more pronounced. The public saw the triumphant entertainer, resplendent in his jumpsuits and commanding the stage with electrifying presence. Privately, he wrestled with doubts, health issues, and the gnawing sense that the machinery of fame was consuming him. The contradiction between the man and the myth weighed heavily, leaving him in a constant struggle to balance the demands of his idolized image with the fragile reality of his inner life. The financial pressures created by his management further compounded these conflicts. Colonel Parker's insistence on continuous performances and engagements ensured a steady flow of revenue, but left little opportunity for Elvis to explore creative avenues outside of commercial ventures. The commercial success of the Las Vegas shows was undeniable, yet they also trapped him in a cycle that prioritized profit over artistry. For Elvis, the conflict between personal expression and external control became a defining theme of this chapter of his life. As the 1970s approached, Elvis stood as a symbol of triumph and contradiction. He had silenced critics who once dismissed him as a fading star, proving his enduring power to captivate and inspire. His comeback special and Las Vegas shows cemented his place as a performer of extraordinary presence and talent. Yet at the same time, the personal costs of maintaining this triumph were mounting. His reliance on medication, his struggles with isolation, and his internal doubts revealed a man at war with himself. In these years, Elvis embodied both the pinnacle of success and the fragility of the human spirit. He was celebrated as a king of entertainment, adored by millions across the world. Yet inside, he remained a man searching for balance, authenticity, and peace. His triumph was real, dazzling, and unforgettable, but it was shadowed by the unresolved conflicts that defined his inner world. The tension between glory and struggle became the essence of this period, shaping not only his life, but also the way the world would remember him. In August 1977, the world was shaken by the sudden news of Elvis Presley's death. At only 42 years old, the man who had defined an era was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt unimaginable to his millions of admirers. For fans who had grown up with his music, his passing was not only the loss of a beloved entertainer, but also the end of a chapter in cultural history. Crowds gathered outside Graceland, his Memphis home, in stunned disbelief, some weeping openly as if mourning a family member. His funeral became a moment of collective grief, uniting people across generations and backgrounds in sorrow for the man who had given them so much joy and inspiration. The circumstances of his death were surrounded by speculation, with many pointing to the years of overwork, the toll of fame, and his dependence on prescription medication. Behind the glittering stage persona lay the reality of a man worn down by relentless schedules and the pressures of maintaining his iconic image. For those closest to him, his death was the heartbreaking culmination of struggles that had long been hidden from public view. Yet for the wider world, the tragedy underscored the fragility of a figure often seen as larger than life. Despite the shock of his passing, Elvis's legacy quickly took on a life of its own. His music continued to dominate airwaves, record sales soared, and new generations discovered his artistry. Songs that once sparked controversy now stood as timeless classics, bridging the gap between past and present. His image, captured in photographs, films, and recordings, became an enduring symbol of vitality, style, and charisma. The cultural phenomenon he had sparked in the 1950s proved not to be fleeting, but instead a permanent fixture in the story of popular music. Graceland transformed from a private residence into a shrine visited by millions each year, becoming a testament to the profound bond between Elvis and his audience. Fans traveled from around the world to pay their respects, leaving flowers, letters, and tokens of gratitude at the gates. The house became more than a landmark. It was a place where people could connect with the memory of a man who had reshaped music and culture. This ongoing devotion testified to the depth of his impact and the enduring resonance of his story. His influence extended far beyond the confines of rock and roll. Artists across genres, from country and gospel to soul and pop, drew inspiration from his vocal style, stage presence, and fearless blending of traditions. The musical landscape after Elvis could not be imagined without his contributions, as he had broken barriers and set new standards for performance. Even decades after his death, countless musicians acknowledged him as a guiding light, a figure whose artistry gave them courage to pursue their own paths. In the years following his passing, Elvis became more than a historical figure. He evolved into a legend. Stories about him circulated widely, sometimes blurring fact and myth, but always reinforcing the sense of awe surrounding his life. For many, he came to symbolize both the promise and the peril of fame. His rise from humble beginnings to international stardom embodied the American dream, while his struggles with personal demons served as a cautionary tale about the costs of that dream. This duality deepened the fascination with his life, ensuring that his story would continue to be told and retold across generations. Elvis's legacy was not only preserved in music and memory, but also institutionalized through tributes, films, biographies, and cultural references that kept him present in the public imagination. From impersonators who celebrated his style to scholarly studies of his influence, the world continued to engage with his life in ways both personal and collective. Each interpretation added to the mosaic of his identity, demonstrating the complexity of a man whose reach extended far beyond entertainment.
Even as time passed, the emotional connection people felt to him did not diminish. His songs still played at family gatherings, on radios, and in films, serving as a soundtrack to both everyday life and moments of celebration. His voice carried a sense of authenticity that transcended eras, making listeners feel as if he were speaking directly to them. This ability to touch hearts long after his death ensured that his spirit remained alive in ways that statistics and records could not fully capture. Ultimately, the tragedy of Elvis Presley's early death only magnified the intensity of his legacy. Cut short at the height of his fame, his life took on a mythic quality, frozen in time as a story of brilliance, struggle, and enduring influence. He became a symbol of how extraordinary talent and charisma can transcend the boundaries of time, inspiring not just admiration, but also reflection on the human condition. For millions, Elvis was not merely a performer, but a companion in their lives, someone whose music gave comfort, joy, and hope. The final chapter of Elvis's life may have been marked by loss, but the story did not end with his passing. His music, his image, and his spirit continued to live on, shaping culture and inspiring generations. The king of rock and roll remained not just a title, but a truth that no tragedy could erase. Through triumph and turmoil, he had left behind more than a legacy. He had become a legend whose presence would forever echo in the world of music and in the hearts of those who loved him.